Commander Siraxa's crimson eyes blazed with cruel amusement as she held the dying human in her forearms, his blood staining her ceremonial armor. The plasma bolt meant for her had torn through his chest instead, and now his final words echoed in the suddenly silent plaza. "At least I finally made you look at me." The highborn warrior, who had once boasted she would vaporize any human foolish enough to court her, now felt something crack inside her crystalline heart. Something she didn't recognize. Something that terrified her more than any enemy plasma cannon ever could. But how had they gotten here? How had a species she considered beneath notice become the one thing she couldn't live without? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning that would change everything began like any other, on the orbital fortress of Kepler VII, with Commander Siraxa of the Third Hegemony demolishing holographic training targets with the casual precision of someone born to kill. Her plasma rifle hummed with deadly energy as she moved through the combat course, her forearms working in perfect synchronization, two gripping the weapon while the others gestured commands to her tactical display. Each shot found its mark with mathematical certainty, reducing the training constructs to glowing particles that dissipated in the recycled air of the combat deck. The fortress itself was a marvel of highborn engineering, a kilometer-long construct of crystalline metal and quantum phase armor that drifted in the void between star systems like a predator waiting for prey. Its interior spaces had been designed with the proportions and aesthetics that appealed to highborn sensibilities. Vast chambers with soaring ceilings that emphasized the species' natural height advantage, lighting that cycled through frequencies visible only to their enhanced optical systems, and gravitational fields calibrated to make their movements appear even more fluid and graceful than nature had already provided. Siraxa's personal combat deck occupied an entire section of the fortress's military wing, its holographic projectors capable of simulating any battlefield scenario from the archives of the dozen Conquer Gamma worlds. This morning she had chosen the siege of Terran Colony 7, a particularly brutal engagement where human defenders had held out for 3 standard months against overwhelming highborn superiority. The historical records indicated that the humans had displayed remarkable tenacity and tactical innovation, qualities that Siraxa found moderately interesting from an academic perspective. Her elite squad watched from the observation gallery, their own crimson eyes reflecting admiration tinged with healthy fear. The highborn were apex predators by design, their ancestors genetically enhanced over millennia to rule the galaxy's lesser species, and Siraxa represented the pinnacle of their evolution. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, her obsidian skin gleamed with an inner luminescence that spoke of the quantum processors woven into her very cells. Her elongated skull housed a brain capable of processing tactical data at superhuman speeds, while her redundant cardiovascular system could keep her fighting long after other species would have collapsed from breast exhaustion. The bioluminescent tattoos that traced intricate patterns across her skin served multiple functions beyond mere decoration. Each line and curve represented achievements in combat, diplomatic victories, or genetic markers that indicated her place in the complex hierarchy of highborn society. The patterns could shift and flow in response to her emotional state, creating a visual language that conveyed information faster than spoken words. At the moment, they pulsed with the steady rhythm of someone completely in control of their environment, a predator at the apex of their hunting ground. "Commander," called out Lieutenant Vorthak from the gallery, his voice carrying the distinctive harmonic undertones of their species. The sound resonated through multiple frequency ranges, creating a complexity of communication that human vocal cords could never achieve. "The human delegation is requesting another security briefing. They seem concerned about tomorrow's ceremony." Siraxa's rifle powered down with a descending whine as she turned toward her subordinate, her expression shifting to one of barely contained disdain. The holographic battlefield around her flickered and died, leaving only the sterile perfection of the combat deck's actual structure. "Humans," she said, the word rolling off her forked tongue like a curse. Her secondary hearts began beating faster, not from exertion, but from the mild irritation that always accompanied thoughts of humanity's endless need for reassurance. Their paranoia would be amusing, if it weren't so pathetic. What could possibly threaten us that we haven't already anticipated? The question wasn't rhetorical. Siraxa's tactical assessments had identified and countered 17 different potential threat scenarios for tomorrow's ceremony, ranging from terrorist attacks to diplomatic sabotage to natural disasters. Each possibility had been analyzed, contingency plans developed, and countermeasures implemented with the methodical thoroughness that characterized highborn military doctrine. The idea that humans might identify some vulnerability that had escaped her enhanced cognitive abilities was not just unlikely but actively insulting. Lieutenant Vorthak's bioluminescent tattoos flickered with patterns that indicated mild amusement mixed with professional concern. They're particularly worried about the purist movement, Commander. Apparently their intelligence services have detected increased communication traffic in several sectors known to harbor extremist cells. The purists, Siraxa repeated, her voice dropping to harmonic frequencies that conveyed contempt bordering on disgust. Terrorists who believe that species should remain forever separate, never learning from each other, never growing beyond their biological limitations. They're exactly the sort of evolutionary dead end I would expect humans to worry about, given their own stunted development. The other members of her squad exchanged glances, their bioluminescent tattoos flickering with suppressed amusement. They had served under Siraxa for 3 standard years, long enough to know that her contempt for humanity ran deeper than mere species prejudice. Where other highborn viewed humans as useful servants or convenient cannon fodder, Siraxa saw them as evolutionary dead ends, creatures so fundamentally limited that even their best efforts were laughably inadequate. Captain Zithix, her second in command, stepped forward with the fluid grace that marked him as a warrior of exceptional breeding. His own tattoos displayed patterns indicating high rank and multiple combat decorations, but they also carried subtle markers that suggested a more complex relationship with the various species that populated, quote, the galaxy. Commander, if I may suggest, the humans' concerns might not be entirely without merit. The purist movement has been increasingly bold in their operations, and tomorrow's ceremony does represent a symbolic target of considerable value. Siraxa's crimson eyes fixed on her subordinate with an intensity that would have reduced lesser beings to nervous stammering. Are you suggesting, Captain, that human intelligence capabilities might exceed those of the third hegemony? That their primitive pattern recognition systems have detected threats that our quantum processing networks have somehow overlooked? The temperature in the combat deck seemed to drop several degrees as Siraxa's question hung in the air like a challenge to single combat. Captain Zithix maintained his composure with the discipline of someone who had survived 3 decades of military service, but his tattoos betrayed subtle shifts that indicated heightened stress responses. Not at all, Commander, he replied carefully. I merely suggest that different perspectives can sometimes reveal angles that might otherwise be missed. The human's evolutionary background has given them certain instinctive responses to potential threats that might complement our more analytical approaches. Perhaps, suggested Captain Zithix, with calculated innocence, hoping to deflect the conversation away from potentially dangerous territory. One of them will try to court you, Commander. I've heard human males have peculiar mating rituals involving the presentation of cultivated plant reproductive organs and vocalizations that they call music. The combat deck erupted in harmonic laughter, the sound resonating through multiple frequency ranges as Siraxa's squad enjoyed their commander's discomfort. The acoustics of the chamber amplified their mirth until it became a physical force that vibrated through the deck plating and into the bones of anyone present. But instead of anger, Siraxa's expression shifted to one of genuine amusement, her secondary hearts beginning to beat faster with the thrill of a new joke. A human? Courting me? She repeated, her voice rising to encompass frequencies that would have shattered human eardrums. The idea was so absurd that her enhanced imagination began constructing elaborate scenarios of increasing ridiculousness. That would be like a microbe attempting to seduce a star, a grain of sand proposing marriage to a mountain, a whisper trying to overwhelm a thunderstorm. The very concept is so completely divorced from reality that IDS almost want to witness it, if only to see how such a primitive creature would even attempt to process the impossibility of their situation." End quote. She raised her plasma rifle, its targeting laser painting a red dot on the far wall, where it carved a small, perfectly circular burn mark in the reinforced bulkhead. Though, I suppose, if any human were foolish enough to try, I could provide them with a demonstration of exactly how such advances would be received. Perhaps I should make it a public spectacle. Broadcast it throughout the human sectors as an educational experience. Let them see what happens when evolution's failures attempt to reach beyond their natural limitations." End quote. The weapon discharged once, carving a molten furrow in the reinforced bulkhead that glowed with residual heat, and her squad's laughter reached a crescendo that shook dust from the ceiling supports. The sound carried undertones of cruelty that would have been familiar to any predator species, the harmonic signature of beings who took pleasure in contemplating the suffering of those they considered inferior. None of them noticed the figure standing in the gallery's shadow, close enough to hear every word, but far enough away to remain invisible to their enhanced senses. The observation galleries were designed with multiple alcoves and recesses that provided concealment for security personnel and maintenance staff, blind spots that even high-born optical enhancements couldn't penetrate without direct line of sight. David Reeves had been listening to alien death threats for the better part of 6 months now, ever since his assignment as personal security liaison to the highborn delegation. As a former Marine turned diplomatic protection specialist, he had thought he understood what he was getting into when the colonial administration offered him the position. The pay was exceptional, the benefits comprehensive, and the opportunity to work with humanity's most powerful allies seemed like the career move of a lifetime. The recruitment process had been exhaustive, involving psychological evaluations, genetic compatibility tests, and cultural sensitivity training that lasted for 3 standard months. David had scored in the 97th percentile on tactical assessment examinations and demonstrated fluency in 4 alien languages, qualifications that should have guaranteed respect from his assigned charges. The briefing materials had emphasized the importance of the position, the delicate nature of human highborn relations, and the career advancement opportunities that would follow successful completion of the assignment. What they hadn't mentioned in the briefing materials was that the highborn considered humans to be roughly equivalent to particularly clever pets, useful for certain specialized tasks, but fundamentally inferior in every way that mattered. David had endured months of casual dismissal, condescending explanations of concepts he understood better than his alien counterparts, and the constant awareness that every highborn he encountered could kill him. Without breaking stride, the cultural differences went far beyond simple prejudice. Highborn society was built around concepts of genetic superiority and evolutionary destiny that made cooperation with lesser species a matter of noblesse oblige rather than genuine partnership. Their enhanced cognitive abilities allowed them to process information at speeds that made human thought seem glacially slow, while their improved physical capabilities rendered human strength and endurance laughably inadequate. Most disturbing of all was their casual attitude toward violence, their willingness to discuss the extermination of entire populations as though they were debating the merits of different lunch options. But Commander Siraxa was different. Where others showed mere indifference, she radiated active contempt. Where others ignored him, she seemed to take pleasure in highlighting his inadequacies. Her comments weren't just dismissive, but actively cruel, designed to reinforce his awareness of his species' limitations while entertaining her subordinates with demonstrations of human futility. And yet, despite everything rational thought told him, David found himself drawn to her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Perhaps it was the way she moved through combat scenarios with fluid grace that made human martial artists look like stumbling children. Perhaps it was the fierce intelligence that burned behind her crimson eyes, an intellect vast and alien, but somehow familiar in its dedication to perfection. Or perhaps it was simply the challenge she represented, the absolute certainty that she would never see him as anything more than a biological curiosity. David had served in 3 combat zones before accepting the diplomatic assignment, experiences that had taught him to recognize and manage attraction under impossible circumstances. He had learned to compartmentalize emotions that could compromise his effectiveness, to maintain professional distance from colleagues whose safety depended on his clear judgment. But none of his training had prepared him for the unique torture of protecting someone who viewed his very existence as evidence of cosmic comedy. The irony wasn't lost on him that his job was to ensure the safety of beings who would cheerfully vaporize him for sport. Every day brought new reminders of his expendability, new demonstrations of the casual cruelty that seemed to define highborn humor. And yet, he persisted, driven by a combination of professional duty and personal fascination that he couldn't entirely explain to himself. David stepped back from the gallery railing, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. The conversation below had moved on to other topics, but the casual dismissal of his species' worth continued to echo in his enhanced hearing. Tomorrow's ceremony would mark the signing of the Titan Accords, a trade agreement that would secure humanity's position in the galactic community for the next century. As security liaison, his job was to ensure that nothing disrupted the proceedings, even if that meant protecting people who would cheerfully vaporize him for sport. The diplomatic quarters assigned to the human delegation occupied a section of the orbital fortress that had been modified to accommodate their physiological needs. The artificial gravity had been adjusted to Earth normal levels, the atmospheric composition tweaked to provide optimal oxygen concentrations, and the lighting spectrum filtered to approximate the solar radiation that human eyes had evolved to process. Despite these accommodations, the spaces felt alien and unwelcoming, their proportions designed for beings significantly larger than baseline humanity. Hours later, in the sterile confines of his assigned quarters, David reviewed the security protocols for what felt like the 1,000th time. The ceremony would take place in the station's central plaza, a vast amphitheater designed to accommodate multiple species while providing maximum visibility for the assembled dignitaries. 3 separate security perimeters, overlapping fields of fire, and enough surveillance equipment to track individual dust motes, all coordinated through his tactical interface. The quarters themselves reflected the strange mixture of luxury and condescension that characterized human highborn relations. The furniture had been scaled down to human proportions, but retained the crystalline aesthetic favored by their hosts, creating an environment that felt like a dollhouse built for very expensive dolls. The environmental controls offered dozens of options for atmospheric composition and gravitational adjustment, capabilities far beyond human technology, but implemented with the casual indifference of beings for whom such marvels were everyday conveniences. David's personal effects occupied a small corner of the main living space, familiar objects from Earth that seemed pathetically primitive in their current context. A photograph of the Colorado Rockies, taken during his last leave before accepting the diplomatic assignment. A collection of physical books, their paper pages an anachronism in a universe where information was typically stored in quantum matrices. A small collection of human music, classical compositions that had somehow survived humanity's expansion into space. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, David's instincts screamed that something was wrong. The problem with perfect security was that it attracted imperfect people. Assassins, terrorists, and revolutionaries all thrived on the challenge of breaking unbreakable systems, and the Titan Accords had attracted more than their share of opposition. The Human Liberation Front viewed the agreement as capitulation to alien masters. The purist movement saw it as contamination of galactic society. And somewhere in the shadows, intelligence suggested, lurked elements of the old hegemony guard who viewed any cooperation with lesser species as treason worthy of death. The intelligence reports made for disturbing reading. The purist movement had been gaining strength throughout the frontier sectors, their message of species separation resonating with populations that felt overwhelmed by the complexity of interstellar politics. Their tactics had grown increasingly sophisticated, evolving from simple propaganda campaigns to coordinated attacks on diplomatic facilities and mixed-species colonies. Most troubling of all were the reports suggesting that they had acquired advanced weaponry from unknown sources, equipment that shouldn't have been available to terrorist organizations. David's fingers moved across his tablet's surface, highlighting potential threat vectors and escape routes with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. The plaza's design favored defenders, but it also created choke points that could become death traps if properly exploited. The surrounding balconies offered excellent overwatch positions, but they also provided concealment for potential snipers. And the ceremony's public nature meant that security had to be balanced against accessibility, creating gaps that a determined assassin might exploit. The tactical analysis consumed hours of his attention, each variable considered and reconsidered, until he had constructed a 3-dimensional model of every possible threat scenario. The plaza's architecture had been designed to accommodate gatherings of multiple species, with sight lines that allowed beings of different heights to observe the proceedings, while security forces maintained overlapping fields of observation. The challenge lay in balancing the ceremonial requirements of the event with the practical necessities of protection. His door chimed softly, the sound configured to human auditory ranges rather than the harmonic complexities preferred by the station's primary inhabitants. David looked up from his work, surprised by the late hour and the unexpected visitor. The station's chronometer indicated local midnight, a time when most of the diplomatic staff should have been resting in preparation for tomorrow's events. "Enter," he called, his hand automatically checking the sidearm at his hip. The door slid open to reveal Commander Siraxa herself, her towering form filling the doorway like a living shadow. She had exchanged her combat armor for what passed as casual dress among the highborn, a flowing garment that seemed to absorb light, while highlighting the bioluminescent patterns that traced her skin. The material appeared to be some form of programmable matter, its surface shifting between different textures and opacity levels in response to her movements. Her forearms hung at her sides with deceptive relaxation, but David's trained eye caught the microtensions that suggested she could draw weapons and fire before he could blink. The sight of her, in his personal space, created a cognitive dissonance that his enhanced reflexes struggled to process. For 6 months, their interactions had been limited to formal briefings and professional exchanges, conversations that maintained the careful distance required by their respective positions. Her presence in his quarters suggested either a security emergency of unprecedented scope or a dramatic shift in the nature of their relationship. "Commander," he said, rising from his desk with carefully measured movements. "Is there a security concern?" Siraxa's crimson eyes swept the spartanly furnished quarters, taking in the regulation furniture, the tactical displays, and the human artifacts that David had brought from Earth. Her gaze lingered on a photograph of the sunset over the Rocky Mountains, her expression unreadable. The image had been taken during his last visit home, a panoramic view that captured the way terrestrial atmosphere scattered light into colors that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. "Your species has an odd relationship with beauty," she said finally, gesturing toward the image with one of her secondary arms. The limb moved with the fluid precision that characterized all highborn motion, each joint articulated with mechanical perfection despite being entirely biological in nature. "You surround yourselves with representations of places and experiences, rather than seeking the authentic. Do you miss your homeworld, human?" The question caught David off guard, not least because it was the first time Siraxa had addressed him as anything other than the security liaison, or that human. There was something in her tone, a quality he couldn't quite identify, that suggested genuine curiosity rather than her usual mocking interest. Her bioluminescent tattoos had shifted to patterns he had never seen before, configurations that his cultural briefings hadn't covered. "Sometimes," he admitted, moving to stand beside her as she examined the photograph. Her height advantage meant that he had to look up to meet her eyes, a physical reminder of the evolutionary distances that separated their species. "Earth has a particular quality of light that's hard to replicate. The way photons scatter through our atmosphere creates colors that don't exist anywhere else in the galaxy. Yet you chose to leave it behind," Siraxa observed, her voice carrying harmonic undertones that David's universal translator couldn't quite capture. The device in his ear provided rough approximations of meaning, but the emotional context of highborn communication remained largely opaque to human understanding. "To serve among aliens who barely tolerate your presence. Why?" David considered several diplomatic responses before settling on honesty. The late hour and unexpected intimacy of the conversation seemed to call for something more authentic than the careful neutrality that typically characterized their exchanges. "Because staying would have been easier, and I've never been good at choosing the easy path." Something shifted in Siraxa's expression, a subtle realignment of features that suggested surprise, or perhaps recognition. Her secondary hearts began beating faster, creating a rhythm that David could feel through the deck plating, and her bioluminescent tattoos flickered with patterns he had never seen before. The display was hypnotic, creating geometric designs that seemed to shift and flow like living things across her obsidian skin. "Tomorrow's ceremony troubles you," she said, and it wasn't a question. Security always troubles me, David replied carefully. It's my job to worry about things that probably won't happen, so that they definitely don't happen. But this is different. Siraxa turned to face him fully, her crimson eyes boring into his with uncomfortable intensity. Her enhanced optical systems were undoubtedly analyzing his micro-expressions, reading physiological indicators that would reveal his emotional state with scientific precision. You sense something that your instruments cannot detect. Your primitive instincts are screaming warnings that your rational mind cannot process. David felt a chill run down his spine, partly from the accuracy of her observation, and partly from the casual way she had dismissed his intuition as primitive. You could put it that way. I could. Siraxa agreed, her tone thoughtful. But that would be inaccurate. Human intuition is not primitive, David Reeves. It is ancient, refined by millions of years of survival on a hostile world, honed by predators and prey alike until it became something approaching prescience. My people lost that gift when we transcended our biological limitations. Perhaps that makes us the primitive ones. The use of his name sent another shock through David's system. In 6 months of working together, Siraxa had never once acknowledged him as an individual, rather than a representative of his species. The shift in her behavior was so unexpected that he found himself searching for hidden meanings, for the trap that surely lay beneath her apparent openness. Her admission about losing intuitive capabilities was even more surprising. Highborn society placed enormous emphasis on their enhanced cognitive abilities, their superiority over lesser species who remained trapped by biological limitations. The suggestion that evolution might involve trade-offs rather than pure improvement contradicted fundamental assumptions about their cultural superiority. You think I'm being paranoid, he said finally. I think, Siraxa replied, that you are the only person on this station who truly understands what we face tomorrow. The Highborn Council sees only opportunity, the human delegation sees only necessity, but you see danger, and that makes you invaluable. She moved toward the door, her movements fluid and predatory, but paused at the threshold to look back at him. The gesture revealed the elegant curve of her neck, the way her elongated skull balanced perfectly on vertebrae that had been genetically optimized for both flexibility and strength. Your security briefing recommended additional personnel for the outer perimeter. I have approved the request and assigned 2 of my best operators to your command. Try not to disappoint them. Commander, David called out as she prepared to leave. Why are you telling me this? Siraxa's expression shifted again, becoming something that might have been amusement, or might have been something else entirely. Her bioluminescent tattoos pulsed with patterns that seemed to echo the rhythm of his own heartbeat, creating a visual symphony that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to deeper levels of awareness. Because tomorrow, David Reeves, you may be the only thing standing between success and catastrophe. And despite what my squad believes, I do not enjoy watching competent individuals fail due to inadequate resources. The door slid shut behind her, leaving David alone with questions that multiplied faster than he could process them. In the space of 10 minutes, his understanding of Commander Siraxa had shifted from contemptuous superior to something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The conversation replayed in his mind as he attempted to return to his security preparations, but concentration proved elusive. Siraxa's unexpected visit had revealed depths to her personality that months of professional interaction had never suggested. Her acknowledgement of human capabilities, her admission of high-born limitations, and most of all her use of his actual name, created cognitive dissonance that his tactical training struggled to resolve. Sleep proved impossible. David spent the remaining hours until dawn running through combat scenarios and contingency plans, his enhanced reflexes responding to simulated threats, while his consciousness wrestled with the implications of his BS. Late-night visitor. By the time the station's artificial lighting began its gradual transition toward day-cycle illumination, he had identified 17 additional potential vulnerabilities in the ceremony's security arrangements and developed countermeasures for each. Dawn came early aboard Kepler-Omen 7, marked not by the rising of a sun, but by the gradual brightening of the station's artificial lighting systems. The orbital fortress maintained a 26-hour day cycle that approximated the circadian rhythms of multiple species, though individual sections could be adjusted to accommodate the specific needs of their bala. Inhabitants. David had been awake for hours, running final checks on security systems and coordinating with the expanded perimeter teams that Commander Siraxa had provided. The two highborn operatives, Sergeant Vex and Corporal Thane, moved through their assignments with the casual efficiency of apex predators, their enhanced senses detecting threats that human equipment might miss. Sergeant Vex stood nearly 9 feet tall, her frame even more elongated than Siraxa's, with bioluminescent tattoos that indicated specialized training in counterintelligence operations. Corporal Thane was built for combat, his forearms equipped with integrated weapon systems that could deploy in milliseconds, his optical enhancements capable of tracking dozens of targets simultaneously. Working with them provided David with new insights into highborn military capabilities. Their tactical communications occurred through subsonic frequencies that bypassed his universal translator entirely, creating conversations that resembled elaborate musical performances more than military briefings. Their situational awareness operated on multiple sensory levels, detecting patterns of movement and behavior that human observers would miss entirely. Most impressive of all was their ability to coordinate complex operations without apparent effort, their enhanced cognitive abilities allowing them to process and respond to tactical information at speeds that made human reaction times seem glacially slow. "Perimeter sweep complete," reported Sergeant Vex through David's earpiece, the translation software struggling with the harmonic complexities of highborn communication. "All approach vectors secured. No anomalous readings detected. Station security reports normal operational status across all sectors." David nodded, his eyes scanning the central plaza as it underwent its final transformation for the ceremony. The amphitheater's modular architecture allowed it to be reconfigured for different events, its seating arrangements and sightlines adjusted to accommodate the specific requirements of each gathering. For the Titan Accords signing, the space had been arranged to provide maximum visibility for the assembled dignitaries while maintaining the security perimeters that David's tactical analysis had identified as essential. The central plaza buzzed with activity as dignitaries from a dozen species took their assigned positions. The human delegation, led by Ambassador Catherine Wells, wore their finest formal attire and expressions of barely contained nervousness. Ambassador Wells herself was a career diplomat whose service record included successful negotiations with 7 different alien species, but even her experience couldn't entirely mask the tension that surrounded Barras. This particular event, the highborn contingent, by contrast, seemed to treat the entire event as a mildly interesting diversion, their bioluminescent tattoos cycling through patterns that David's cultural briefings suggested indicated boredom. Their casual attitude toward the proceedings that had consumed months of preparation and negotiation was typical of their species' approach to interstellar relations. A reminder that what represented historic achievement for humanity was merely routine business for beings who had been managing galactic affairs for millennia. Representatives from other species added their own complexities to the gathering. The Crystalline Collective sent a delegation of silicon-based entities whose communication methods involved precisely controlled electromagnetic emissions. The Hive Worlds contributed a group consciousness that manifested as dozens of individual bodies, sharing a single distributed intelligence. The Aquatic Alliance arrived in environmental suits that maintained the high-pressure, high-moisture conditions their physiology required. Commander Siraxa stood at the center of it all, resplendent in ceremonial armor that seemed to bend light around its edges. The garment was clearly technological rather than merely decorative, its surface embedded with systems that David's enhanced optics couldn't fully analyze. Her 4 arms moved in subtle gestures that directed the flow of security personnel, coordinated communication frequencies, and monitored threat assessments with an efficiency that made David's own grasp. Preparations looked primitive by comparison. Their eyes met across the plaza, and for a moment, David felt the same disorientation that had characterized their conversation the night before. Siraxa's expression was professionally neutral, but her bioluminescent tattoos displayed patterns that seemed somehow warmer than her usual configurations. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it left David with the uncomfortable awareness that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. Perimeter teams report all clear, came the voice of Sergeant Vex through David's earpiece, the translation software struggling with the harmonic complexities of highborn communication. No anomalous readings, no suspicious movement patterns, no indication of hostile intent. All designated observation points are occupied and operational. David nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered to witness the ceremony. Representatives from the major news networks, cultural observers, diplomatic staff, and the inevitable collection of curiosity seekers who seemed to materialize at any significant event. All properly screened, all carefully positioned, all monitored by enough surveillance equipment to track their individual heartbeats. The screening process had been exhaustive, involving background checks that traced each attendee's history back through multiple generations. Psychological profiles that analyzed their likelihood of engaging in disruptive behavior, and biometric scans that would allow the security systems to track their movements throughout the ceremony. David had personally reviewed every file, flagging individuals whose profiles suggested even minimal risk factors for additional scrutiny. And yet his instincts continued to scream that something was wrong. The sensation had grown stronger throughout the morning, an itch between his shoulder blades that no amount of tactical preparation could eliminate. His enhanced reflexes remained on edge, responding to threats that his conscious mind couldn't identify, preparing for combat scenarios that rational analysis suggested were highly unlikely. The ceremony began with the traditional exchanges, each species offering formal greetings in their own languages, before the universal translators converted everything into comprehensible harmony. The linguistic complexity was staggering, with some species communicating through chemical emissions, others through electromagnetic patterns, and still others through quantum fluctuations that existed at the edge of Krau. Detectable reality. Ambassador Wells spoke eloquently about humanity's place in the galactic community, her words carefully crafted to acknowledge highborn superiority while asserting human dignity. The speech had been refined through months of diplomatic negotiation, every phrase analyzed for potential misinterpretation, every concept tested against the cultural sensitivities of a dozen different species. Today marks not just the signing of a trade agreement, Wells declared, her voice carrying across the plaza through amplification systems that translated her words into frequencies comprehensible to non-Bray human species, but the recognition of humanity's commitment to peaceful cooperation with all sentient beings. The Titan Accords represent our species' dedication to growth through partnership rather than domination through conquest. The highborn responses were equally diplomatic, offering partnership while making it clear that such partnership remained conditional on continued good behavior. Commander Siraxa herself delivered the formal acceptance, her harmonic voice creating patterns of sound that were almost musical in their complexity. The third hegemony acknowledges humanity's application for expanded trading privileges, she said, her words carrying undertones that David's translator rendered as formal but respectful. Your species has demonstrated the capacity for growth and adaptation that marks true intelligence. We welcome this opportunity to guide your continued development toward greater galactic citizenship. David barely heard any of it. His attention remained focused on the crowd, on the patterns of movement and behavior that might indicate hostile intent. Training and experience had taught him to look for the anomalies, the individuals who didn't quite fit their assigned roles, the micro-expressions that suggested deception or malicious purpose. The surveillance systems provided constant updates through his tactical interface, biometric readings and behavioral analyses streaming past his enhanced awareness in real-time data flows. Heart rates, stress indicators, movement patterns, and attention focus all tracked and categorized by artificial intelligence systems that could process more information in seconds than human analysts could evaluate in hours. That was why he noticed the figure in the upper gallery, partially concealed behind a decorative pillar, whose attention seemed focused not on the ceremony, but on Commander Siraxa herself. David's enhanced optics zoomed in automatically, revealing a humanoid silhouette that registered as neither fully human nor clearly highborn. The figure's clothing suggested diplomatic credentials, but something about their posture triggered every alarm in David's tactical awareness. The individual was tall enough to be highborn but lacked the distinctive elongation of limbs that characterized that species. Their clothing bore the appropriate credentials for diplomatic access, but the garments seemed somehow wrong, as though they had been designed to conceal rather than display the wearer's actual physiology. Most disturbing of all was their attention pattern, the way their gaze remained fixed on Commander Siraxa with an intensity that suggested something far beyond casual observation. "Control, this is Reeves," he subvocalized into his comm unit, activating the emergency frequency that would bypass normal communication protocols. "I have a potential threat in Gallery Section 7, upper tier. Individual appears to be tracking the highborn commander. Request immediate backup and identification verification." "Acknowledged," came Sergeant Vex's immediate response, her harmonic voice carrying undertones of alertness that hadn't been present moments before. "Moving to investigate. Corporal Thane is adjusting position to provide overwatch, maintain surveillance, and prepare for possible hostile action." But even as David watched, the figure's position shifted, revealing the distinctive outline of a plasma rifle configured for long-range precision work. The weapon was compact enough to be concealed beneath diplomatic robes, but David's enhanced optics recognized the characteristic energy signature that marked it as military-grade hardware. The targeting laser remained invisible to normal vision, but his enhanced systems detected the coherent photons as they painted an invisible line through the air. The laser's endpoint was somewhere in the vicinity of the ceremonial platform, where Commander Siraxa stood with her back to the gallery, completely unaware of the threat that was developing behind her. The assassin's position provided a clear line of sight despite the security measures that David had implemented, exploiting a gap in coverage that existed only because the diplomatic nature of the event had required certain accommodations for ceremonial visibility. Time seemed to slow as David's enhanced reflexes kicked in, adrenaline flooding his system as training and instinct merged into pure reaction. His tactical interface highlighted the threat vector in bright red overlay graphics, calculating trajectory and impact probability with mechanical precision. The assassin's finger tightened on the trigger, biometric sensors detecting the muscular contractions that preceded weapon discharge, the plasma rifle's charging cycle reaching critical threshold. The plasma bolt began its journey toward a target who remained completely unaware of the danger, its coherent energy discharge traveling at a significant fraction of light speed across the plaza's open space. David's enhanced reflexes, calculated trajectory, impact probability, and interception angles with superhuman precision, his body already in motion before his conscious mind had fully processed the threat. David moved without conscious thought, his body launching itself across the 20 feet of open space that separated him from Commander Siraxa, with the desperate speed of someone who had nothing left to lose. Behind him, he could hear Sergeant Vex's voice, shouting warnings in harmonic frequencies that human ears couldn't properly process, the sound creating interference patterns that momentarily disrupted the bias. Plaza's acoustic systems. Around him, the crowd began to realize that something was wrong, their conversations dying as instincts older than civilization recognized the approach of violence. The distance seemed to stretch infinitely as David's enhanced reflexes fought against the limitations of baseline human physiology. His augmented nervous system could process information at superhuman speeds, but his muscles and bones remained fundamentally organic, subject to the same physical laws that governed all biological matter. Each step felt like an eternity as he watched the plasma bolt's trajectory converge with Commander Siraxa's position, death approaching with mathematical certainty. Commander Siraxa's enhanced senses finally detected the threat in the microseconds before impact, her forearms beginning to move in defensive patterns that might have saved her life if she had possessed another fraction of a ball. Second, her bioluminescent tattoos flared with patterns that indicated extreme stress as her quantum-enhanced nervous system processed the impossibility of her situation, calculating escape vectors that didn't exist and defensive options that wouldn't arrive in time. The plasma bolt struck David's center mass as he tackled Commander Siraxa, driving both of them to the ground in a tangle of limbs and ceremonial armor. The energy discharge tore through his tactical vest and into his chest cavity, burning through tissue and bone with the clinical efficiency of weapons designed to kill highborn warriors. David felt his body systems beginning to shut down, even as his momentum carried them both behind the dubious shelter of the ceremonial podium. The impact sent shockwaves through both their bodies, David's human physiology absorbing energies that would have been merely painful to a highborn, but proved catastrophic to his more fragile biological systems. The plasma bolt had been calibrated for Siraxa's enhanced cellular structure, its energy output calculated to overcome her species' natural resistance to directed energy weapons. Against human tissue, the effect was devastating. Commander Siraxa's forearms moved with inhuman speed, two reaching for weapons while the others assessed David's condition with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in battlefield medicine. Her crimson eyes widened as she took in the extent of his injuries, the plasma burn that had carved a path from his right shoulder to his lower abdomen, leaving charred flesh and exposed bone in its wake. Her enhanced optical systems analyzed tissue damage, blood loss rates, and nervous system trauma, with clinical precision that only made the severity of his condition more apparent. "Medic!" she called, her voice carrying harmonic frequencies that would summon every medical professional within half a mile. The sound created resonance patterns that activated emergency beacons throughout the station, triggering automated systems that dispatched trauma teams and sealed potential contamination zones. Human down, plasma wound, immediate intervention required. All medical personnel to Central Plaza, priority Alpha emergency. Around them, the plaza erupted into controlled chaos as security forces moved to secure the area and locate the assassin. The highborn operatives that David had coordinated with throughout the morning now demonstrated the lethal efficiency that made their species the galaxy's apex predators. Sergeant Vex materialized behind the assassin's position with impossible speed, her integrated weapon systems deploying in a display of technological superiority that reduced the threat to component atoms. In milliseconds, David could hear the distinctive whine of highborn weapons discharging, followed by the harmonic screams that indicated successful target elimination. The threat was over, the ceremony saved, the accords preserved for future signing. Security protocols activated automatically, sealing the plaza and initiating investigation procedures that would identify every individual who had been present during the attack. None of it mattered. David's vision began to blur as his cardiovascular system struggled to compensate for massive trauma, but he could still see Commander Siraxa's face hovering above him, her expression cycling through emotions that he had never seen her display. Shock, anger, something that might have been fear, and beneath it all, a growing realization that seemed to transform her alien features into something almost recognizable. The medical teams arrived with equipment designed to treat highborn physiology, their efforts to adapt their procedures to human biology hampered by fundamental differences in anatomy and biochemistry. David could hear their harmonic conversations as they debated treatment options, their enhanced cognitive abilities processing his condition with mechanical precision that offered little hope for positive outcomes. His enhanced hearing picked up fragments of their analysis, clinical assessments that painted a picture of damage too extensive for their technology to repair. The plasma bolt had destroyed major organs, severed critical nervous system pathways, and introduced thermal damage that exceeded the regenerative capabilities of human cellular repair mechanisms. Their medical technology was advanced enough to keep him conscious for these final moments, but not sufficient to address the fundamental incompatibility between human physiology and highborn weapons. "Why?" Siraxa asked, her voice dropping to frequencies that bypassed his universal translator entirely, speaking directly to some deeper part of his consciousness. Her four hands moved constantly, two attempting to staunch bleeding while the others checked vital signs with desperate efficiency. "Why would you do this? Why would you sacrifice yourself for someone who has shown you nothing but contempt?" David tried to speak, but his damaged respiratory system could barely manage a whisper. Blood flecked his lips as he fought to form words that suddenly seemed infinitely important, the last communication he would ever make to the being who had dominated his thoughts for 6 months of careful observation, hopeless attraction. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was finally having an honest conversation with Commander Siraxa, that it had taken mortal injury to break through the barriers of species prejudice and professional distance that had kept them apart. Her crimson eyes were only inches from his own, close enough that he could see the complex patterns of bioluminescent tracery that decorated her features, close enough to recognize the intelligence and vulnerability that her harsh exterior had always concealed. "Because," he managed finally, each word a struggle against failing biology, "at least I finally made you look at me." The words hit Commander Siraxa with visible force, her secondary heart stopping entirely for several seconds, as her enhanced nervous system struggled to process their implications. Her bioluminescent tattoos flickered through patterns that spoke of shock so profound that her quantum-enhanced consciousness couldn't immediately categorize it. Around them, medical personnel continued their desperate efforts to stabilize his condition, but their harmonic conversations had taken on undertones of futility that even David's failing senses could detect. "Look at you?" Siraxa repeated, her voice breaking across multiple frequency ranges as she cradled his head in her lower arms, while her upper hands continued pressing against his wounds. "You think I haven't been looking at you? You think I haven't noticed your dedication, your competence, your refusal to be intimidated by beings who could destroy you without effort?" David felt consciousness slipping away, but before the darkness claimed him entirely, he saw something in Commander Siraxa's crimson eyes that he had never expected to witness. Tears, actual tears, flowing down her obsidian cheeks in patterns that traced the bioluminescent markings beneath her skin, each drop glowing with the same internal light that had always marked her as something beyond human understanding. The sight was so unexpected, so contrary to everything he understood about highborn psychology, that David wondered if his failing nervous system was generating hallucinations in his final moments. But the tears were real, their chemical composition registering on his enhanced olfactory systems as compounds that human science had never encountered, molecules that spoke of grief expressed through alien Brahma. Biochemistry. "No," she whispered, her voice carrying frequencies that made the air itself seem to vibrate with barely contained emotion. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to make me feel this and then leave." But David was already gone, his final breath escaping in a sigh that seemed to take something vital from the world around them. Commander Siraxa knelt in the growing pool of his blood, her forearms holding his lifeless body with a gentleness that none of her subordinates had ever seen her display, her tears falling like liquid starlight onto his correct, peaceful face. The medical team worked with frantic efficiency, their instruments detecting fading life signs and attempting desperate interventions, but human physiology had limits that even highborn technology couldn't pray to us overcome. The plasma bolt had done too much damage, destroyed too many vital systems, left too little intact tissue to sustain life. Their enhanced medical capabilities could extend the dying process, could maintain biological functions for brief periods beyond natural death, but they couldn't reverse the fundamental incompatibility between human cellular structure and directed energy weapons. "Time of death, 1437 Station Standard," announced the chief medical officer, his harmonic voice heavy with professional regret. "Cause of death, massive plasma trauma resulting in total system failure. Subject expired before full medical intervention could be implemented. All resuscitation efforts have been exhausted." Commander Siraxa didn't acknowledge the pronouncement. She remained kneeling beside David's body, her enhanced hearing detecting the absence of heartbeat and respiratory function, while her advanced intellect processed the implications of what had just occurred. The human who had annoyed her, frustrated her, and somehow earned her grudging respect had died to preserve her life, and in doing so, had accomplished something that no amount of tactical brilliance or diplomatic cunning had ever achieved. He had made her care. The realization hit her with the force of a plasma cannon, shattering assumptions that had guided her worldview since adolescence. Humans weren't just primitive animals stumbling through a universe they couldn't comprehend. They weren't evolutionary dead ends, or amusing pets, or convenient tools. They were something else entirely. Something that her people had lost in their rush toward perfection. Something that David Reeves had possessed in abundance, even as he drew his final breath. They were capable of love so profound that death became irrelevant. Lieutenant Vorthak approached cautiously, his own bioluminescent tattoos flickering with patterns that indicated uncertainty and concern. The plaza around them had been secured, the threat eliminated, and the investigation teams were already beginning their analysis of the assassination attempt. Protocol demanded that normal operations resume as quickly as possible, but the disruption be contained and minimized to prevent broader security implications. "Commander," he said carefully, his harmonic voice modulated to avoid frequencies that might seem threatening or demanding. "The area has been secured. The assassin has been eliminated. and preliminary investigation suggests they were affiliated with the purist movement. Shall I begin the formal incident report? Siraxa looked up at her subordinate, and Vorthak took an involuntary step backward at what he saw in her crimson eyes. The cold certainty that had always defined her had been replaced by something raw and dangerous, an emotion so alien to highborn psychology that his translator systems couldn't properly categorize it. Her bioluminescent tattoos had shifted to patterns that he had never seen before, configurations that seemed to express concepts for which their language had no adequate words. "Send a message to the Highborn Council," she said, her voice carrying harmonic overtones that made the air itself seem to vibrate with barely contained power. "Inform them that Commander Siraxa of the Third Hegemony hereby requests immediate transfer to the Qua Colonial Diplomatic Corps. I have work to do among the humans." "Commander?" Vorthak's confusion rippled through multiple frequency ranges, creating interference patterns that disrupted nearby communication systems. "I don't understand. The humans are a lesser species. Why would you want to serve among them?" Siraxa's gaze returned to David's still face, her tears still flowing in patterns that traced ancient symbols of mourning across her alien features. The human's expression was peaceful, almost serene, as though death had finally provided him with the rest that life among aliens had never allowed. His final words continued to echo in her enhanced auditory memory, replaying with perfect fidelity every nuance of Das, meaning, and emotion. "Because," she said softly, her voice carrying frequencies that conveyed concepts her subordinate's limited experience couldn't comprehend, "I have discovered that in all the ways that truly matter, they are our superiors. And I have a debt to repay." The weeks that followed David's death passed in a blur of official inquiries, diplomatic negotiations, and personal transformation that left those who knew Commander Siraxa struggling to recognize the being she had become. Assassination attempt had been traced to a cell of purist extremists who viewed any cooperation between species as contamination of galactic purity, their investigation revealing a network of sympathizers that extended throughout several star systems. The assassin himself had been a hybrid being, part human and part Altarian, whose mixed heritage had allowed him to pass through security screenings designed to identify specific species characteristics. His weapon had been acquired through black market channels that traced back to rogue elements within the old Hegemony Guard, military personnel who had never accepted their government's decision to engage with lesser species as equals rather than subjects. The Titan Accords were signed in a subdued ceremony that honored David's sacrifice while cementing humanity's place in the galactic community. Ambassador Wells delivered a eulogy that spoke of courage, dedication, and the bonds that could form between beings of different species when they recognized their common hopes for a peaceful future. The highborn delegation contributed their own memorial, a harmonic composition that translated David's sacrifice into frequencies that would be comprehensible to a dozen different species. But for Siraxa, none of the political maneuvering mattered as much as the discoveries she made while investigating the human who had died for her. David's personal effects revealed a man of depth and complexity that her preconceptions had never allowed her to perceive. Books of human poetry, their physical pages filled with marginalia that revealed a mind capable of finding beauty in the most unlikely circumstances. Recordings of earth music, classical compositions that demonstrated an appreciation for harmony and structure that rivaled anything in highborn culture. Most revealing of all was his correspondence with family members who spoke of his kindness and dedication. Personal messages that painted a picture of someone who had chosen service to others over personal advancement throughout his entire career. Parents who worried about his safety but respected his commitment to diplomatic service. A sister who sent regular updates about life on Earth, sharing mundane details that spoke of love and connection across interstellar distances. His personal journals provided the most disturbing insights into the man she had dismissed as primitive and limited. David's tactical analyses demonstrated a grasp of multi-species psychology and threat evaluation that rivaled anything produced by highborn intelligence services. His observations about alien prey, behavior patterns, cultural motivations, and strategic thinking revealed an intellect that she had never bothered to recognize. Most painful of all were his personal reflections on their working relationship. Entries that revealed his growing admiration for her tactical abilities, coupled with his awareness of her contempt for his species. He had written about the challenge of protecting someone who viewed his existence as cosmic comedy, about the professional satisfaction he derived from successful security operations despite the personal cost of constant dismissal. Commander Siraxa represents everything I've spent my career preparing to work with. Read one particularly devastating entry. Intelligence, dedication, and tactical brilliance, combined with the physical capabilities to implement solutions that human limitations would never allow. If I could make her see that humans have value beyond our utility as servants, it would justify every insult and dismissal I've endured. But I'm beginning to suspect that her prejudices run too deep for individual merit to overcome. The weight of that realization threatened to crush her enhanced cardiovascular system. David Reeves hadn't been a primitive animal stumbling through an incomprehensible universe. He had been a professional whose skills complemented her own, whose insights might have prevented future tragedies if she had possessed the wisdom to listen. Worse still, he had been someone who had seen past her harsh exterior to recognize qualities that even her own people took for granted. Someone whose final act of sacrifice had been motivated not by duty or species loyalty, but by something far more profound and personal. Siraxa's transfer to the Colonial Diplomatic Corps was approved with unusual speed, partly due to her exemplary service record, and partly due to the political capital generated by her association with David's sacrifice. The Highborn Council recognized that her unique perspective on human-alien relations might prove valuable in future diplomatic efforts, particularly given the growing complexity of interstellar politics and the emergence of new terrorist threats. Her new assignment placed her aboard the diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge, where she would serve as military advisor to human Highborn joint operations throughout the frontier sectors. The ship itself represented a new generation of cooperative engineering, its design incorporating both species' technological advantages to create capabilities that neither could achieve alone. Human intuitive design principles had been combined with Highborn manufacturing precision to produce a vessel that was both elegant and efficient. Her first day aboard the human-crewed vessel provided immediate proof that her preconceptions had been dangerously incomplete. The ship's captain, Maria Santos, possessed a tactical awareness that allowed her to outmaneuver highboard opponents in wargame scenarios. Her human intuition compensating for the mathematical precision that sometimes blinded enhanced intellects to unconventional solutions. Captain Santos was a veteran of 3 frontier conflicts. Her service record including successful negotiations with hostile alien species and innovative solutions to seemingly impossible tactical problems. During their initial briefing, she demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed even Siraxa's enhanced analytical capabilities, identifying potential solutions to complex problems that pure logic might have overlooked. The key to working with multiple species, Santos explained during Siraxa's orientation, is recognizing that every evolutionary path produces both advantages and limitations. Highborn analytical capabilities are unmatched, but human intuition can sometimes identify patterns that pure logic misses. Crystalline collective computational power is extraordinary, but they struggle with emotional motivations that drive biological species. The trick is finding ways to combine strengths while compensating for weaknesses. The chief engineer, James Park, had developed modifications to standard drive systems that improved efficiency by 12%. His innovations based on principles that combined human mechanical intuition with highborn quantum theory. His engineering philosophy emphasized practical solutions over theoretical elegance, an approach that produced results even when the underlying physics remained incompletely understood. "I don't need to understand why something works," Park explained while showing Siraxa through the ship's engineering sections. "I just need to understand how to make it work better." Human engineering has always been about practical experimentation rather than theoretical perfection. We try things, see what happens, and build on what succeeds. The medical officer, Dr. Sarah Chen, had pioneered treatment protocols that successfully adapted highborn healing techniques for human physiology. Her research bridging the gap between radically different biological systems. Her work had already saved dozens of lives during frontier conflicts, where mixed-species medical teams had to treat casualties from grass. Multiple evolutionary backgrounds. The challenge isn't just the obvious differences like cardiovascular systems or nervous structure, Dr. Chen explained during Siraxa's medical briefing. It's the subtle interactions between different biochemistries, the way treatments that heal one species can be toxic to another. David Reeves' case taught us that we need to develop emergency protocols that can adapt to any biological system, not just the ones we're familiar with. These weren't inferior beings struggling to comprehend advanced concepts. They were colleagues whose different evolutionary paths had produced capabilities that complemented high-born abilities in ways that created synergistic effects. Working together, human intuition and high-born analysis produced results that neither species could achieve alone. The discovery should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it filled Siraxa with a grief so profound that her enhanced emotional processing system struggled to contain it. David had tried to show her this truth through months of dedicated service, professional excellence, and quiet devotion. She had been too blinded by prejudice to see what should have been obvious from their first meeting. Late at night, in the privacy of her expanded quarters, Siraxa would study the holographic recordings of David's final moments. The ship's artificial intelligence had preserved every detail of the assassination attempt, creating three-dimensional reconstructions that allowed her to analyze the event from multiple perspectives. She could watch David's enhanced reflexes respond to the threat, see the desperate calculation in his eyes as he computed trajectory and interception angles, witness the moment when professional duty transformed into personal sacrifice, the way he had moved without hesitation when he saw the threat, launching himself across impossible distances with the desperate speed of someone who had everything to lose. The peaceful expression on his face as life ebbed away, as though death had finally provided him with the recognition he had sought throughout their professional relationship. Most haunting of all were his final words, spoken with the last breath in his damaged lungs. "At least I finally made you look at me." She had been looking at him, she realized now. Looking and seeing only what her preconceptions allowed her to perceive, filtering his every action through assumptions that prevented genuine understanding. David had known this, had accepted it, had continued serving with dedication and skill despite her casual cruelty. He had loved her not, despite her flaws, but including them, seeing something in her that she had never seen in herself. The realization that she had been loved so completely, so unconditionally, by someone she had treated with such contempt, became a weight that threatened to collapse her enhanced skeletal structure under its moral gravity. Worse still was the growing awareness that his love hadn't been based on idealization or fantasy, but on genuine recognition of her capabilities and potential. His journals revealed observations about her tactical thinking, her leadership abilities, and her hidden capacity for growth that demonstrated a depth of understanding she had never suspected. She could be the bridge between our species. Read one particularly devastating entry. Her intelligence and tactical abilities are obvious, but there's something else beneath the surface. Moments when her mask slips, and I can see the person she might become if she could get past her prejudices. If she could learn to see humans as equals rather than servants, she could help build the kind of cooperation that would benefit everyone. 6 months after David's death, Siraxa found herself standing in the observation deck of Harmony's Edge, watching the swirling beauty of the Andromeda Nebula through reinforced transparisteel. The colors reminded her of something David had once said about Earth's sunsets, about the way photons scattered through atmosphere to create beauty that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. She was beginning to understand what he had meant, beginning to see the universe through eyes that weren't filtered by assumptions of superiority or evolutionary destiny. The nebula's patterns shifted and flowed like living things, vast currents of gas and energy that followed physical laws, but created results that seemed almost artistic in their complexity. Stellar formation created new light sources that painted the surrounding matter in colors that spanned the entire electromagnetic spectrum, creating a display that was simultaneously scientific and beautiful. Commander Siraxa? The voice belonged to Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, one of the human officers who had served under David before his transfer to diplomatic protection. Torres had requested assignment to Harmony's Edge specifically to work with XEA, Siraxa, her personnel file indicating both exceptional tactical abilities and a personal interest in interspecies cooperation. Captain Santos requests your presence in the briefing room. We've received intelligence about purist activity in the Kepler system. Siraxa turned from her contemplation of distant stars, her crimson eyes meeting the human's brown ones with an openness that would have shocked her former squad. Torres stood with the confident posture of someone who had learned to see aliens as colleagues rather than superiors or threats. Her expression indicating professional respect rather than the submissive deference that Siraxa had once expected from human subordinates. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Siraxa replied, her harmonic voice modulated to frequencies that Torres' universal translator could process with minimal distortion. "Please inform the captain that I'll be there momentarily." As Torres departed, Siraxa allowed herself one final look at the nebula's swirling patterns. Somewhere in that cosmic dance of gas and starlight, she could almost see David's face, peaceful and forgiving, reminding her that love wasn't about deserving or earning, but about choosing to see the infinite value in another being's existence. The irony was that David had been wrong about one thing. He hadn't just made her look at him. He had made her see herself, see her people, see the universe itself, through new eyes that revealed truths she had spent her entire life avoiding. His sacrifice had been the catalyst for a transformation that was still ongoing, a process of growth and change that challenged everything she had believed about species hierarchies and evolutionary destiny. The briefing room was filled with the quiet efficiency of professionals preparing for another mission, another chance to build the bridges between species that David had died protecting. Captain Santos stood at the head of the conference table, her tactical displays showing intelligence reports from throughout the frontier sectors. The data painted a picture of increasing purist activity, coordinated attacks on mixed species facilities, and growing political support for species separation movements. "The situation is more serious than we initially assessed," Santos began as Siraxa took her place among the assembled officers. "Purist cells have been targeting diplomatic facilities throughout the frontier, their attacks growing more sophisticated and better coordinated. Intelligence suggests they've acquired military-grade equipment from unknown sources and may be planning something larger than isolated terrorist incidents." Lieutenant Torres activated her own display, showing communication intercepts and movement patterns that suggested a coordinated campaign rather than random violence. "We've identified at least 12 separate cells operating in a coordinated network. Their activities synchronized in ways that suggest central command and control. Most disturbing is evidence that they've infiltrated several diplomatic missions, potentially compromising security at the highest high levels." Siraxa studied the tactical data with her enhanced analytical capabilities, her quantum-enhanced consciousness processing patterns and probabilities at speeds that would have overwhelmed baseline human cognition. But she also found herself applying insights that David's sacrifice had taught her, looking for the emotional motivations and psychological factors that pure logic might overlook. "They're not just planning attacks," she said, her harmonic voice carrying frequencies that conveyed certainty based on intuitive analysis. "They're building towards something symbolic, an event that would demonstrate the impossibility of interspecies cooperation. The pattern suggests they're seeking a target that would cause maximum psychological impact rather than just physical damage." Captain Santos nodded, her expression indicating respect for Siraxa's assessment. "That matches our analysis. The question is where and when they'll strike next. Their target selection has been unpredictable, hitting both high-value diplomatic facilities and seemingly random civilian installations." As the briefing continued, Siraxa felt the familiar satisfaction of professional collaboration, the synergistic effect that occurred when different perspectives combined to produce insights that individual analysis might miss. But beneath the tactical planning lay a deeper awareness of what they were really fighting for. The possibility of a future where beings like David Reeves could serve alongside aliens who recognized their value, where species differences became sources of strength rather than barriers to understanding. The mission would be dangerous, requiring the kind of cooperation between species that the purist movement viewed as abomination. There would be risks, challenges, and quite possibly casualties among the beings she had learned to value as individuals rather than representatives of their genetic heritage. But there would also be opportunities to honor David's sacrifice by proving that his faith in interspecies cooperation had been justified. "We'll need to coordinate with local security forces," Siraxa said, her tactical recommendations flowing naturally from analysis that combined high-born logic with human intuition. "But we should also be prepared for the possibility that purist infiltrators have compromised those same forces. David always said that the greatest threats come from the ones you don't expect." The mention of David's name created a moment of respectful silence in the briefing room, a recognition of the sacrifice that had brought them all together. His death had become a symbol of the cooperation they were fighting to protect, proof that the bonds between species could transcend evolutionary differences when individuals chose to see past their limitations. Commander Siraxa of the Third Hegemony had died in that plaza on Kepler-Omen 7, her worldview shattered by the reality of human love and sacrifice. In her place stood someone new, someone who understood that the true measure of a species wasn't its evolutionary advantages or technological achievements, but its capacity to see value in forms of life that didn't mirror its own limitations. She had laughed at the idea of loving a human, but David Reeves had taught her that some ideas were too profound for laughter, too important for dismissal, too valuable to lose. In the end, she hadn't just learned to love a human. She had learned to love the parts of herself that David had seen and valued, the potential for growth and change that existed even in beings who considered themselves perfect. The plasma bolt that had killed David had been meant for her, but in a way, it had found its target after all. It had destroyed the Commander Siraxa, who believed in the absolute superiority of her species, leaving in her place someone capable of building the future that David had died to protect. As the briefing continued, and the familiar rhythms of planning and preparation took hold, Siraxa allowed herself a small smile, one that her human colleagues would have recognized as belonging to someone who had learned to see beauty in unexpected places. David was gone, but his final gift to her remained, the knowledge that love could transcend any boundary, overcome any prejudice, and transform even the most unlikely hearts. She had finally learned to look at him, really look, and in doing so, had discovered that the universe was far more beautiful and complex than her enhanced intellect had ever imagined possible. The human who had taken a plasma bolt, meant for her, had given her something more valuable than life itself. The capacity to love without reservation, to see without prejudice, and to build bridges across the vast spaces between different forms of consciousness. In the end, that might be the most human trait of all, and perhaps the one that would ultimately prove most valuable in building the kind of galaxy that David Reeves had believed was possible. A place where species could work together, not despite their differences, but because of them. Where love could flourish across evolutionary boundaries. And where sacrifice could plant seeds that would grow into understanding across the infinite darkness between the stars.